The sun had barely risen over the Pacific horizon when the massive silhouettes of Japanese battleships cut through the morning mist. Their decks alive with activity, sailors moving with precision, confident in the impenetrable armor of their vessels. The pride of the Imperial Navy, yet beneath the calm. There existed a tension that even the most seasoned officers could not articulate, a subtle sense that this day would be unlike any other. Because on the horizon, barely perceptible through the haze, Allied ships prepared to unleash a weapon so clandestine, so devastating, that the Japanese had no warning, no knowledge, and no preparation that could possibly withstand its impact. And then, with a sudden, almost imperceptible flash, the first shell was launched, a projectile designed to move faster than the human eye could follow, so perfectly engineered that when it struck, there was no conventional explosion, no tearing of metal, no fireball to mark its presence, only the eerie, impossible effect of armor literally giving way. Steel bending and cracking under pressure that should have been insufficient to cause damage. And as the first battleship shuddered under the impact, the crew froze in disbelief. Instruments failing, rivets popping silently, bulkheads warping as if under an invisible hammer. And officers raced across decks shouting orders that no one could follow. Because the shell seemed to move according to its own will, finding gaps, exploiting weaknesses that human strategists had spent years fortifying. And as more shells followed, each more precise than the last, the horror spread like wildfire, entire guns disabled, turrets frozen mid-rotation, radar and communication arrays damaged in ways that engineers could not explain. And sailors, trained to obey orders without question, found themselves powerless, witnessing their mighty vessels reduced to motionless hulks, helpless in the face of a force that was neither fire nor conventional weapon, but something that defied understanding, leaving chaos, panic, and disbelief in its wake. And while commanders attempted to organize countermeasures, the shells struck again and again, each time with surgical accuracy, avoiding any predictable trajectory, sometimes skipping across water or armor in ways that should have violated the laws of physics, yet leaving perfect destruction behind. And the psychological impact on the Japanese Navy was immediate and devastating because no training, no courage, no experience could prepare them for a weapon that attacked not just the body of the ship, but the confidence, morale, and trust of everyone aboard. And as engineers and tacticians attempted to analyze the pattern, they found anomalies that defied every calculation, every ballistic model, every known principle of material science, because the shell interacted with the battleship's hull in ways that suggested an almost intelligent design, exploiting stress points, weaknesses, and imperfections that should have been irrelevant to its destructive potential. And as the word of this unprecedented weapon reached the highest echelons of naval command, disbelief turned into desperation, the Emperor's aides demanding answers that no one could provide. Intelligence officers combing through intercepted Allied transmissions, trying to find evidence of technological breakthroughs or experimental ordnance, and yet the reports came back empty, leaving only speculation, fear, and the haunting realization that the Japanese fleet was facing a weapon unlike any in history, a phantom round capable of striking anywhere, anytime, and rendering even the largest battleships powerless. And in the midst of this chaos, survivors described sensations that no one could rationally explain, a ghostly heat running along the decks, instruments freezing and melting simultaneously, metal groaning under pressure with no apparent contact, and a sense of invisible force pressing down on men and machinery alike, leaving a battlefield at sea that was as psychologically devastating as it was physically destructive. And while the Allied crews observed from a distance, documenting the devastation with careful precision, the Japanese sailors struggled to comprehend the impossible, their fear compounded by the inability to trace the shell's origin, predict its path, or mount any form of defense. And as night fell over the shattered fleet, officers gathered in emergency councils, scribbling frantic notes on maps and charts, attempting to rationalize the weapon in terms of traditional ballistics, ordnance science, and naval strategy, only to find that every model failed. Every equation contradicted observation, and every hypothesis collapsed under the weight of repeated, precise destruction. And as this narrative unfolds, the viewer is drawn into the terror, suspense, and mystery of a fleet rendered helpless, of sailors witnessing their proudest ships transformed into floating coffins by a hidden shell that no one saw coming, leaving the haunting question lingering in every mind, both in the story and the audience's: what kind of weapon could strike with such precision, evade all detection, and render the mightiest battleships powerless? And could it appear again, anywhere, at any time, leaving nothing but destruction, fear, and unanswered questions in its wake, setting the stage for the next point where the story escalates further, revealing not just the physical devastation, but the desperate Japanese attempts to understand, counter, and survive a weapon that defied every expectation of war, logic, and human ingenuity. As reports of the hidden shell's unprecedented destruction swept through the Japanese fleet, the panic and disbelief escalated to levels never before experienced by even the most battle-hardened admirals, because the sheer precision and seemingly intelligent targeting of the shell made every battleship, no matter how heavily armored or fortified, feel suddenly fragile, vulnerable, and exposed. And as the first wave of shells disabled gun turrets, communications arrays, and engine rooms without warning, officers in command bunkers struggled to maintain control, issuing frantic orders that were often impossible to enforce, because crews frozen with fear could not move, could not react, and could not comprehend that their mighty vessels, long considered symbols of invincibility, were powerless against a weapon that appeared to operate beyond the known limits of physics and warfare. And while tactical teams attempted to analyze trajectories, speeds, and points of impact, every model failed. Every calculation contradicted real-world observations, and every theoretical explanation crumbled under the relentless, perfect destruction of the shell, leaving naval engineers and strategists grappling with a horrifying reality: that the fleet's most prized warships were being neutralized, not by human skill or conventional weaponry, but by an invisible, unstoppable force whose behavior defied understanding. And as the shell continued to strike in multiple locations, patterns began to emerge that made even the most experienced officers question their training, their knowledge, and the very nature of combat itself, because it appeared to seek out critical systems in Joom's rooms, command centers, ammunition, storage without deviation, striking with near-intentional precision, leaving some decks eerily untouched, while collapsing others entirely. And this selective devastation added a psychological layer to the material destruction, creating fear and confusion that spread like wildfire throughout the fleet, undermining morale, command cohesion, and the ability to respond to new threats. And while intelligence officers reviewed intercepted Allied transmissions, scoured blueprints, and attempted to identify new ordnance technologies, no evidence emerged of any experimental shell capable of such feats, leaving the high command increasingly desperate, haunted by reports from surviving crew members describing ghostly lights, invisible trails cutting across the ocean, a whisper of pressure or heat moments before impact, and instruments behaving as though possessed, all contributing to a growing consensus that the shell was not merely a weapon, but a phenomenon operating on principles that could not be measured, predicted, or countered by any known science. And as engineers and officers worked around the clock, moving from ship to ship, analyzing damage, testing small-scale replicas, and attempting controlled firings, they were met only with frustration and catastrophic failures, because any attempt to recreate the effect produced either inconsequential results or violent explosions that destroyed test equipment, proving that the hidden shell's destructive power was not only unparalleled, but fundamentally irreproducible. And while the fear on the front lines was immediate, the ripple effects reached the highest levels of Japanese command, creating political tension, strategic paralysis, and a sense of helplessness that pervaded both planning rooms and battle decks. Because the very existence of a weapon that could strike so decisively, unpredictably, and invisibly forced commanders to rethink every engagement, hold back fleets, and reconsider the viability of their entire naval strategy. And as day turned into night across the Pacific, the psychological toll intensified. Sailors reported an oppressive sense of doom. Officers hesitated to order maneuvers, and entire units refused to
advance into areas previously targeted by the Phantom shell, leaving gaps, delays, and vulnerabilities in the fleet's defensive lines. And as the hidden shell continued to claim victories without being seen, the viewer is drawn deeper into the terror, suspense, and mystery, witnessing not just the destruction of metal and machinery, but the unraveling of discipline, the erosion of confidence, and the helplessness of men confronting an enemy that operated beyond comprehension. Setting the stage for the next point where the escalating horror, desperate investigations, and strategic consequences of this unstoppable weapon will push the narrative to even greater tension, suspense, and revelation. As the hidden shell continued its relentless assault across the Pacific theater, the Japanese Navy found itself plunged into an unprecedented state of chaos and desperation, because the weapon's effects were not only physically devastating but psychologically insidious, undermining confidence, morale, and the ability of commanders to issue coherent orders. And as each successive strike disabled critical battleships, crippled communications, and left once mighty vessels adrift or frozen in place, officers scrambled to assess damage, issue repairs, and coordinate countermeasures, only to realize that the shell defied all conventional understanding, striking with a precision and selectivity that no human could achieve, exploiting weaknesses in armor and structure that engineers had never anticipated, and often leaving the ship partially intact yet utterly incapacitated, creating an eerie scene of paradoxical destruction, where decks, turrets, and hulls remained standing but the ship could neither move nor defend itself. And as crews watched in frozen horror, they reported inexplicable phenomena accompanying each strike. A faint, shimmering trail cutting across the sky or the surface of the ocean, a sudden sensation of heat or pressure along the metal surfaces, instruments warping without physical contact, and in some cases, entire control rooms rendered non-functional without a visible cause, leaving sailors and officers alike questioning the limits of physics, metallurgy, and the very laws of nature. And as intelligence teams compiled reports, compared survivor accounts, and examined captured Allied documents, they found no indication of new technology, experimental shells, or advanced propulsion methods that could account for the devastation, leaving them to speculate on theories ranging from unknown chemical reactions to hidden energy weapons, or even phenomena bordering on the supernatural. And while the officers struggled to rationalize the attacks, the fear among the crews reached critical mass, because hesitation, panic, and disbelief spread faster than the shell itself, causing delays in maneuvers, confusion in formations, and, in several cases, abandonment of strategic objectives, leaving the Japanese fleet increasingly vulnerable, fragmented, and paralyzed. And engineers attempted to reconstruct the shell using scale models, high-velocity test firings, and metallurgical analysis. But every attempt failed catastrophically, producing explosions, warped equipment, or results that bore no resemblance to the observed effects, reinforcing the conclusion that this weapon was not only unstoppable but fundamentally incomprehensible. And as the hidden shell continued to strike, rumors and whispers spread across ships and bases, describing ghostly lights, invisible streaks, and almost intelligent targeting. While the psychological toll intensified, officers and sailors reported nightmares, hallucinations, and dread so pervasive that even routine drills became exercises in fear. And the High Command faced an impossible dilemma: maintain fleet operations in the face of a weapon they could not understand, counter, or predict, or risk complete strategic collapse by holding back their forces. And as councils met in bunkers far from the front, plotting desperate defensive measures, maps covered with red ink showing incapacitated ships, engineers scribbling frantic calculations and diagrams that never reconciled with reality, the scale of the crisis became terrifyingly clear. The hidden shell was not just a weapon, but a force capable of redefining naval warfare, shattering both the material and psychological pillars of the fleet. And as night fell over the Pacific, the silence between strikes was punctuated by the haunting knowledge that the next attack could come at any moment, leaving ships motionless, crews helpless, and commanders powerless. And as the viewer follows the story, they are immersed not just in explosions and destruction, but in the human element of terror, desperation, and bewilderment, understanding that the hidden shell was a phenomenon that rendered experience, skill, and preparation meaningless, setting the stage for the next point, where the Japanese attempts to fight back, innovate, and survive the ghostly onslaught will reach their most suspenseful and horrifying moments yet, leaving the audience on the edge of their seats, compelled to continue watching to discover the full scale of the weapon's devastating power. As the hidden shell's relentless campaign of destruction pressed on, the Japanese Navy scrambled to understand and counter the weapon, convening emergency councils aboard surviving ships and in coastal command bunkers, officers poring over blueprints, damage reports, and survivor testimonies in a frantic attempt to find patterns, weaknesses, or clues that could be exploited. Yet every effort only revealed deeper mysteries, because the shell's destructive precision and unpredictability confounded all known science. And while engineers tested alloys, reinforced armor, and conducted high-velocity trials on decommissioned vessels, each attempt failed catastrophically, producing explosions, warped equipment, or results entirely inconsistent with the devastation witnessed in the field, leaving the teams frustrated, exhausted, and haunted by the enormity of the challenge. And as word of these failures spread, morale among crews and commanders alike plummeted, because they realized that the fleet's most heavily fortified battleships, once symbols of invincibility, were now effectively helpless, their guns frozen, engines disabled, and communication arrays shattered, rendering coordination nearly impossible. And as they observed the next attacks, sailors reported phenomena that defied explanation. Faint shimmering lights streaking across the ocean, subtle vibrations in the hull moments before impact, instruments failing without contact, and a pervasive sense of invisible force pressing upon men and metal alike, leaving them paralyzed with fear. And the psychological toll was staggering, because hesitation, panic, and disbelief spread faster than the shells themselves, disrupting formations, delaying maneuvers, and causing officers to second-guess every order. All while the enemy fleet launched attacks with devastating efficiency, exploiting the paralyzed Japanese response. And as intelligence officers combed through captured documents and intercepted transmissions, they found no evidence of advanced technology or experimental ordnance capable of producing such effects, leaving them to speculate on possibilities ranging from clandestine Allied engineering breakthroughs to unknown energy weapons, or even phenomena that bordered on the supernatural. And while the human mind struggled to process the impossible, the material destruction continued unabated, with each strike disabling gun turrets, collapsing superstructures, warping armor, and leaving crews helpless, trapped within vessels that could no longer fight or flee. And as officers attempted to coordinate countermeasures, the hidden shell struck again, often avoiding areas reinforced with additional armor, while targeting weak points that engineers had believed were impervious, reinforcing the terrifying impression that the weapon was operating with near intelligence, seeking critical systems with surgical precision. And as the Japanese fleet reeled under this unrelenting assault, the High Command debated increasingly desperate measures. Hold the fleet in port, disperse ships, implement experimental tactics, or retreat entirely, knowing that any decision could be obliterated by the next invisible, unstoppable strike. And as night fell over the Pacific, the psychological impact became as lethal as the shell itself, with sailors haunted by shadows, flickers of light, and an oppressive sense of doom, officers losing confidence in every plan, and the fleet's operational effectiveness deteriorating to critical levels, leaving the audience fully immersed in the terror, suspense, and mystery of a weapon that could strike at will, defy all prediction, and render the most powerful ships on the ocean helpless, setting the stage for the next point, where the escalating horror, desperate countermeasures, and human resilience will collide in a climax that will push the story to even greater suspense and engagement, leaving viewers riveted and unable to look away. As the hidden shell continued its merciless attacks, the Japanese Navy descended further into chaos, because every strike reinforced the terrifying reality that no battleship, no matter how fortified, could withstand this unprecedented weapon. And as ships lay crippled, engines frozen, gun turrets immobilized, and communication lines severed, officers and crews struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster unfolding before them. And while commanders convened emergency strategy meetings, poring over damage reports and plotting evasive maneuvers, the shell's behavior continued to defy logic and expectation, striking with surgical precision at critical systems while leaving surrounding structures seemingly untouched, creating an atmosphere of surreal horror where the normal rules of warfare no longer applied. And as sailors described ghostly trails across the ocean, fleeting flashes of shimmering light, and a pressure along decks that had no physical source, the psychological toll became overwhelming, with hesitation, panic, and despair spreading faster than the attacks themselves, causing delays in maneuvers, disorganized formations, and even outright refusals to engage, leaving the fleet increasingly vulnerable and exposed to further destruction. And as engineers and ordnance specialists attempted to replicate the weapon's effects in secret testing facilities, every attempt failed catastrophically, producing either insignificant results or violent explosions that destroyed testing equipment, proving definitively that the hidden shell's power was beyond human reproduction or understanding. And while intelligence officers scoured Allied transmissions, blueprints, and reconnaissance data for any clue, they found nothing, forcing even the most rational minds to entertain impossible explanations, from undiscovered advanced technology to energy weapons beyond the contemporary science of the era, or even forces bordering on the supernatural. And as the shell continued to strike, the Japanese fleet's operational capability crumbled, with entire squadrons immobilized, supply lines disrupted, and command coordination rendered almost meaningless, creating gaps and vulnerabilities that the enemy exploited with terrifying efficiency. And as officers attempted to organize defensive maneuvers or launch counterattacks, fear paralyzed decision-making, reinforcing the impression that the weapon operated almost intelligently, seeking the most critical targets with unerring accuracy. And as night fell across the Pacific, the psychological impact deepened. Sailors haunted by shadows, flickers of light, and the oppressive sense of inevitable destruction, officers losing confidence in every plan, and the very concept of control evaporating, leaving the fleet at the mercy of a weapon that defied prediction, replication, and understanding. And as the viewer follows this harrowing story, they witness not only the physical devastation of armored vessels rendered powerless, but also the collapse of morale, the unraveling of command structure, and the human terror of facing an enemy that strikes with precision yet leaves no trace, setting the stage for the final point, where desperation, the ultimate consequences, and the chilling climax of the hidden shell's impact will converge in a suspenseful finale designed to keep viewers riveted to the very last second, questioning the limits of technology, strategy, and human resilience in the face of the inexplicable. As the hidden shell's relentless campaign reached its terrifying apex, the Japanese fleet faced an existential nightmare, because every battleship, no matter how heavily armored, seemed suddenly fragile and powerless under a weapon that struck with surgical precision and vanished without a trace. And as officers convened in emergency councils aboard surviving ships and coastal command bunkers, poring over maps, damage reports, and survivor testimonies, they realized that conventional strategies, training, and tactics were useless against a phenomenon that appeared to operate beyond human comprehension. And while engineers attempted desperate experiments with scale models, high-velocity test firings, and reinforced hulls, every replication failed catastrophically, producing only explosions, warped equipment, or inconclusive results that reinforced the terrifying impossibility of the shell's effect. And as sailors recounted the phenomena they had witnessed, shimmering trails across the water, instruments freezing without contact, hulls bending and twisting as if under invisible force, and an oppressive sense of doom pressing upon them, the psychological impact became as lethal as the shell itself, with hesitation, panic, and disbelief spreading faster than the weapon, causing disorganized maneuvers, delayed counterattacks, and at times, outright refusal to engage, leaving the fleet increasingly exposed and vulnerable, and as the hidden shell struck again and again, disabling turrets, crippling engines, and shattering communications, officers and crews were forced to confront a horrifying reality: that this was not a conventional weapon but a force that defied prediction, evaded all countermeasures, and rendered even the mightiest vessels helpless. And while intelligence teams scoured all possible sources for clues, intercepted transmissions, captured blueprints, secret engineering notes, they found nothing, leaving only speculation that ranged from clandestine Allied technological breakthroughs to unknown energy-based ordnance, or even forces beyond contemporary physics. And as day turned to night, the fleet lay in eerie silence, ships motionless, crews haunted, officers trembling with frustration and fear, knowing that the next strike could occur at any moment, striking the most critical targets without warning, leaving devastation and panic in its wake. And as the final strikes fell, entire squadrons immobilized, supply lines severed, and command structures collapsing, the viewer is drawn into the full scale of the catastrophe, witnessing not only the physical destruction of battleships rendered powerless, but also the human terror, despair, and helplessness that gripped those aboard. And in these final moments, the chilling question lingers: if a weapon can strike with perfect precision, defy all prediction, evade all detection, and leave devastation in its wake without explanation, what else could exist in war beyond human understanding? And could it strike again anywhere at any time, leaving no trace but terror, ruin, and unanswered questions? And as the screen fades to black over the silhouettes of shattered vessels, scorched decks, and paralyzed crews, the haunting truth settles in. The hidden shell, the weapon they never saw coming, remains an enigma, a ghostly force beyond comprehension, a terrifying reminder that in the theater of war, the most dangerous threats are not always the ones we can see, measure, or understand, but the ones that appear from nowhere, strike without warning, and leave only destruction, fear, and a mystery that will haunt history forever, ensuring that the viewer is left breathless, unnerved, and compelled to reflect on the limits of human knowledge, the vulnerability of even the mightiest war machines, and the chilling reality that some weapons operate beyond the grasp of reason itself. As the hidden shell continued its devastating campaign across the Pacific, the Japanese fleet faced its most dire crisis yet, because the weapon struck not only with unimaginable precision, but with an eerie invisibility, rendering even the most fortified battleships completely powerless. And as officers convened in emergency councils, frantically reviewing maps, damage reports, and survivor testimonies, they realized that every known tactic, strategy, and defensive measure was utterly ineffective against a force that seemed to operate beyond human comprehension. And while engineers raced to replicate the shell in secret testing facilities using reinforced models, high-velocity experiments, and complex calculations, each attempt failed catastrophically, producing nothing but explosions, warped equipment, and results entirely inconsistent with the destruction witnessed in the field, leaving scientists, tacticians, and commanders alike exhausted, frustrated, and haunted by the enormity of the challenge. And as sailors described the inexplicable phenomena accompanying each strike, shimmering ghost-like streaks across the water, sudden heat and pressure along decks, instruments freezing without contact, hulls bending under an invisible force, the psychological terror became as lethal as the weapon itself, spreading panic, hesitation, and disbelief faster than the attacks, disrupting formations, delaying maneuvers, and in some cases causing outright refusal to follow orders, leaving the fleet exposed, paralyzed, and vulnerable. And as the shell struck again, disabling turrets, crippling engines, and shattering communications, officers confronted the terrifying truth. This was not a conventional weapon, but a force that defied all prediction, science, and understanding. And while intelligence teams searched every possible source, intercepted transmissions, captured blueprints, secret engineering notes, no clue emerged, forcing speculation ranging from secret Allied technological breakthroughs to unknown energy-based ordnance or even forces beyond physics. And as darkness fell over the Pacific, the fleet lay eerily still, ships motionless, crews haunted and trembling. Knowing that the next strike could come at any moment, targeting critical systems with perfect accuracy, leaving devastation and panic in its wake. And in these final moments, the viewer is drawn fully into the scope of the catastrophe, witnessing the complete physical destruction of battleships, the unraveling of morale, and the helplessness of crews and commanders alike. And as the screen lingers on the silhouettes of crippled vessels, scorched decks, and paralyzed officers, the chilling question hangs in the air. If a weapon can strike with perfect precision, evade all countermeasures, and leave destruction and terror in its wake without explanation, what else could exist beyond human comprehension, and could it strike again anywhere at any time, leaving only devastation, fear, and unanswered questions? And as the final frame fades, the haunting reality settles in. The hidden shell, the weapon they never saw coming, remains an unsolved enigma, a ghostly force beyond reason, a terrifying reminder that in war, the deadliest threats are not always those we can see, measure, or understand, but those that appear from nowhere, strike without warning, and leave only destruction, fear, and mystery that will haunt history forever, ensuring viewers are left breathless, unsettled, and compelled to imagine the unimaginable power that operated in silence, invisibly, and with unstoppable precision.